Welcome to our third live TEDxNorthbrookLibrary event, Create Your New World. My name is Kate Hall, and I am the Executive Director here at the library. Whether you've been to one of our TEDx programs in the past or this is your first one, I want to welcome you and say how excited we are to have you attending our live stream event today. This TEDx program is sponsored by the Friends of the Library, who we want to thank for making today's program possible. As you may know, TED is an annual conference and nonprofit group dedicated to ideas worth spreading. TEDx are locally organized events modeled after the annual TED conference. Each TEDx event is a chance to show the world just how talented, passionate, and interesting communities like ours are. Now, we may not be able to all physically gather here today, but we are so glad that we have the opportunity to share these talks with you wherever you are right now. We thank you for tuning in today. I feel very confident that today's speakers and their ideas will ignite your own passion and curiosity. But before we start, we wanted to announce that there has been a change in our program lineup. We will not be featuring Carrot Goodman-Lucker's talk on permaculture gardens, but we have a TED Talk video on environmentalism that we are excited to share with you all. And now for a short introductory video.
Welcome to something special. Welcome to TEDx. This TEDx event is part of a global conversation that takes place every day in every corner of the world. In schools, in theaters, in workplaces, even in prisons, people gather to hear the best ideas bubbling up in their communities. More than 3,000 TEDx events are held every year in 170 countries. It's a remarkable thing. TEDx events are self-organized under a license from TED, a nonprofit organization devoted to discovering and sharing powerful ideas in the form of TED Talks. It's not TED itself, but your local TEDx team of volunteers that has done all the work to put on today's event, including booking all of the speakers. It's this team's ideas, dedication, and time that have made this possible. We really hope today's program sparks an exciting conversation. This is a day for curiosity and for skepticism, for inspiration and for action. The more you enter into it, the more you will take out. And now, on with the show.
We're going to start things off with our first speaker who made a big discovery when she decided to go through her online order purchases. Kristyn Ivey is a KonMari consultant and home stylist who has a special talent for teaching people how to tidy up. Today, she explores how reviewing your purchase history can not only help you declutter your home, but find more happiness with mindful shopping. And here to take the stage now is Kristyn.
It's been said that if you stand in the middle of your home and take a look around, everything you see used to be money. I learned this the hard way. As an engineer in Washington, D.C., with a six-figure salary and a credit score in the 700s, on paper, I was a success. But inside, I was a mess, uncertain and underwhelmed. At 35, I decided to move into my parents' basement and take an adulting break. I planned to use this year-long intermission as a way to save some money, find my purpose, maybe even find a new job that allowed me to make more of a difference. As the end of my adulting break approached, my favorite design blog featured Marie Kondo's bestseller, The Life-Changing Magic of Tidying Up. I fell in love with Marie's KonMari method and its radical self-cariness. It's the anti-baby step approach to a clutter-free home. So it's as charming as it is progressively uncomfortable. I've always loved interior design, planning things, and putting things in order. So as soon as I finished that book, I ran to my closet and started to ask myself what did and did not spark joy. What was left was 6 bags ready to go to donation and $300 worth of clothes that were brand new with tags that did not spark joy. Now, I'm no stranger to an annual purge, but this time around, I asked myself why. Why did I have so many extra things? What was really going on here? What was the lesson my clutter had to teach me? I continued to tidy well beyond clothing, making thousands of decisions about everything in my home through a lens of joy. I let go of old notes from grad school, home goods that never quite worked, even sentimental items, everything from photos to furniture that represented past seasons of my life. I was determined to be an extension of a home that I honored. The beautiful thing about the KonMari method is it gives you permission to keep whatever you want to, as long as it sparks joy. The challenging thing about the KonMari method is it gives you permission to keep whatever you want to, as long as it sparks joy. I let go of a lot of things, but I confidently kept 58 pairs of shoes, and every last one of them sparks joy. Now, I didn't understand why I loved these shoes so much until I found a note that I wrote my mom in elementary school, describing a favorite experience. Everything about this experience revolved around shopping and the mall. 3 different stores, the quest to find the perfect shoes. In that moment, my clutter spoke up. I was emotionally stuck, and no amount of cyclical purging was going to get me out. I was stuck under mindless purchases, unhealthy habits, unfinished business, and unfulfilled career aspirations recycled year after year. I used the act of acquiring more as a way to bury the guilt, anxiety, and shame associated with my inability to achieve true joy and happiness in major areas of my life. All that from looking at my closets. Retail played a significant role in my childhood. But as an adult, I used the comfort and ease of online shopping as a way to check out and ignore deeper issues, which is probably why when I reached the end of my tidying event, I still felt like there was work to be done. I had found a place for absolutely everything in my home. But I realized that I needed to shift my time, energy, and resources that I used to organize my home to other areas of my life that needed some attention. I made it a game. How many aspects of my life could I declutter? I started to let go again. I let go of my life in the DC metro area and my parents' basement to move to Chicago and explore a new city. I let go of 14 years in corporate America so that I could start my own small business as a professional home organizer and certified KonMari consultant, helping others to let go of stuff to live a truly abundant life. I even let go of 30 pounds, which I kind of gained back during quarantine, but I'm in the process of losing again. I carefully examined my relationship with how I consumed absolutely everything. Social media, junk mail, even the amount of water that I drank every day. But there was more. $30,000 more. Consumer debt that had accumulated over more than 10 years of mindless purchases and living beyond my means. It was the dark cloud that shaded every milestone I'd had since the very first day I chose to pay over time versus pay balance in full, which is what led me to go to a place where no one has ever willingly gone before, my Amazon order history. After decluttering with clients for more than 1,000 hours, I'd seen a lot of miscellaneous items purchased online. I was leaving my client's apartment one day, and I walked past her front desk manager. She stopped me and mentioned that there were some clients or tenants who probably needed my help. She based this off of the fact that they received a large number of Amazon boxes through the mailroom each and every day, which is why I renamed miscellaneous clutter Amazon.com. Amazon.com clutter is an ever-expanding catalog of readily accessible retail therapy. The good news is, when you declutter, you uncover sticky habits and opportunities for improvement through self-awareness. So I could confront my financial clutter just like I confronted the clothes in my closet, really feeling the weight of those purchases in my life, so I could redefine what enough meant for me. The engineer in me was geeking out about this idea of looking through spreadsheets of Amazon data. So I isolated my purchases from 2010 to 2020. And I excluded things like gifts that I purchased for others, groceries, business expenses, and returns. What was left was 721 items, totaling $18,171. So that's about $1,800 in spending per year on Amazon. The average Amazon Prime member spends about $1,400 a year on the platform. So not a great time to be above average, but I continued to check out those individual purchases, and I noticed that most of them were under $20 and represented promises I had made myself and never kept, the true cost of trial and error, and phases of my life that define who I am today. There was my mini trampoline moment. I bought that thing brand new, used it once, and then sold it in a yard sale. I guess bouncer sizing really wasn't my thing. Then there was the quest to find the perfect headphones, the revolving door of products that represented my 5-year natural hair care journey, and my budding cross-stitch hobby. I continued to look at those frequent purchases, and I noticed that over the past 10 years, most of my spending was in home goods, shoe care, skin care, and my dog Carbon. I was actually pretty surprised by how accurately my order history reflected my interests and values, but there was definitely some room to tighten up my savings so that my spending could more comfortably fit into my vision of financial independence. I was also super curious about how many of those 721 items still remained in my home till this day after 10 years of shopping, 4 of which were spent adopting this clutter-free lifestyle. There were 337 items left that still sparked joy, which meant that I had let go of a little over 50% of everything that I purchased on Amazon over the past 10 years. With a thank you to end the season of those items in my life. It took me 18 hours to complete this analysis, but it will influence every purchase I make moving forward. And that's the power of radical self-care. Looking at your order history isn't as exciting as maybe taking a bubble bath or buying yourself some flowers, but there are rewards on the other side if you just get a little messy, learn, and then let go. Ultimately, the money is spent. I can't go back in time and change that. I made what I thought was the best decision for those items based on the knowledge and the resources that I had at that time. I let go of everything that didn't serve me, and I held on to the lesson that my clutter taught me. Because looking at my purchases allows me to make more mindful choices and not dwell in the past or try to predict the future use of something someday. The clutter in your order history has something to tell you. Are you listening? I challenge you to get a little uncomfortable in order to take care of yourself and your budget by looking at your shopping behaviors on your favorite platform. We all have the opportunity to shop mindful, making values-driven decisions based on what we need, what we can afford, and what can fit in our beautiful homes and lives. Each and every time we click, place your order. Thank you.
Our next speaker is going to address a subject that many of us did not learn about in school: disability. Lauren Schrero is a disability activist and is the co-founder and executive director of the Nora Project, a nonprofit organization providing disability inclusion training and curriculum to teachers. In this talk, she will teach you how to create more welcoming, inclusive spaces for children of differing abilities. We now welcome Lauren to the stage.
When I was 8 years old, I moved to one of those idyllic suburban streets with tons of young families that ends in a huge cul-de-sac. I spent most of the rest of my childhood in that cul-de-sac, playing foursquare and kickball and rollerblading in circles. Most of the kids I grew up with on the block would say the same thing. But there was one boy, a couple years older than me, who was a little different. He talked differently and behaved differently, and he didn't spend much time outside with the rest of us. I remember asking an adult on the block one day why the boy was going inside after school instead of staying out to play. I don't remember exactly what the adult said, but I do remember the look on their face. It was like, "Ugh, I have no idea how to answer this question, and I really wish you hadn't asked." I distinctly remember being told that the boy had problems and that I should stay away from him. And that was the extent of my education on disability growing up. No one ever talked to me about it in school, not once, ever. So everything I learned about disability, I learned by inference. For example, I inferred from the adult's grimace and from the fact that no one talked about disability that it was something shameful. And I didn't have students with disabilities in my classes, at least not that I was aware of, so I inferred they didn't belong there. I didn't have children with disabilities on my sports teams or in my theater productions or in my dance classes, so I inferred they couldn't participate. And from what I saw, when children with disabilities needed help, that help was provided by adults, so I inferred they couldn't really be friends with other children. In short, I inferred from my life experience that children with disabilities were very different from me, that they weren't really a part of my community, and frankly, I grew up hardly caring about disability at all. To the extent I gave it any thought, I thought disability was sad, definitely a problem, even a little scary. And disability mattered even less to me as a young adult. As a political science and international studies major at one of the most progressive colleges in the country, I took courses in human rights and humanitarianism, political philosophy, identity studies. And I cannot, for the life of me, recall ever learning about disability within any of them. I had one college classmate with a visible physical disability, and I specifically recall thinking to myself what an anomaly she was. So smart for a disabled person. And then I went on to law school, where I learned all kinds of obscure laws that frankly don't matter at all in everyday life. But I never learned about the civil rights legislation at the core of the disability rights movement. I'm not sure I could have if I'd wanted to. Disability was off my radar. And I fear it may have been forever if my daughter Nora hadn't come into my life. When Nora was 9 months old, it became clear she had significant physical and intellectual disabilities. I mourned. I mourned because I believed her disabilities meant her quality of life couldn't be as good as mine, that everything would be somehow worse and harder for her. I mourned because I feared what others would think of her. I mourned because I thought that, like the little boy on my block, she was destined to grow up an outsider. If I'm being honest, I mourned mostly for myself, believing that a child with disabilities like Nora's couldn't bring me the joy I'd hoped to experience in parenthood. Fortunately, it didn't take long for Nora to teach me that everything I'd inferred about disability was wrong, and that I was losing precious time mourning the loss of the child I thought I wanted, instead of reveling in the wonders of the one I was lucky enough to have. Let me catch you up. Nora is neither sad nor a problem, and she certainly isn't scary. She's a little girl. She is capable of learning and of friendship and of recreating, though she'll do all those things differently than I do, which is challenging and can be frustrating for both of us. But really, it's fine, and it can often be joyful and really exciting. Nora is loved, and she feels love. She melts my heart. She infuriates me. She makes me laugh. Just like her little sister, she runs me through the full spectrum of emotions on a daily basis. She's a person. She matters exactly like all people matter. She demands and deserves to be seen and included and supported and accommodated so that she can live her best life. How could I have missed that? How many people had my ableism hurt? How many people had I pitied who I should have gotten to know? How many people had I judged as less than without knowing a single thing about them other than that they had a disability? How many people had I walked past, or worse, turned away from? How many friends had I missed out on? And as these questions swirled inside of me, I realized I had a lot to learn. Years and years and years of catching up to do on what this disability thing is all about. And I also realized that if my daughter's peers were going to know the things I was learning, someone was going to have to teach them, and fast, or else they'd be left to draw the same wrong inferences I drew growing up. And that would be terrible for Nora. And it would be terrible for her peers, too. So together with my cousin, who at the time was a 5th grade teacher, I founded an organization to do exactly that, to provide mindset training, curriculum, and coaching to teachers so that they can teach their students about disability as diversity, and so that they can facilitate meaningful, equitable inclusion in their schools. The organization is called the Nora Project, named for my daughter, who is now 6 years old. At the outset of my Nora Project journey, I was disappointed to find that despite a great deal of legal progress, many things haven't changed since my years as a student decades ago. For example, it remains the norm to segregate students with intellectual disabilities and autism into separate special education programs. And those programs sometimes exist in different hallways or even different buildings than the rest of the education in the community. Children with complex medical and accessibility needs are often forced to attend schools miles from their neighbors because their local public schools simply aren't equipped to include them. Today, 30 years after the passage of the ADA, most public schools in the United States still are not fully accessible. And even in those cases where students with and without disabilities are taught in the same physical space, there are opportunities to really get to know one another, to forge the kinds of friendships that make lasting impacts. Those opportunities are scarce. And while inclusive public education certainly isn't right for every child, regardless of whether they have a disability, we can do better. It's time for schools to start building more accessible, empathetic, inclusive cultures. Here's how, in 3 manageable steps. First, demystify disability. Teach about disability as you would any form of human diversity. Don't ascribe a positive or negative value to disability. Teach simply that it exists, always has, always will, that most people will experience disability in their lives because disability is part of the human experience. Teach about assistive technology and medical equipment and how it works to empower adaptation. Teach about accessibility and universal design and how everyone benefits when everyone can participate. Teach about the rights and accomplishments of people with disabilities. Read their books, study their art. Talk about the discrimination they face and why it's wrong. Help students understand why language matters, what words are appropriate, how to be allies. Take away the stigma by giving students a language for disability, by naming, identifying, and standing against ableism, and by creating a dignified place for disability studies in every child's education. Number 2, teach friendship skills. Anti-bullying programming has become very popular in American education, and it should be. This programming serves an important purpose, but let's be clear. Not being a bully is not the same as being a good friend. And how to be a good friend is not obvious, particularly to somebody who seems very different from you. Fortunately, there are foundational friendship skills that can be taught and practiced and honed over time, and they can be applied to all your relationships. These skills include understanding the needs of others and anticipating and adapting for those needs. They include empathy, imagining how other people feel, and pro-social behaviors like taking those feelings into account on the playground or when you're making your birthday party invitation list, or even when you're deciding how to phrase a question. Studies show that students who are explicitly taught these skills are not only better friends, but better employees, better teammates, better partners, and happier adults overall. Friendship skills are critical to living in community. Whether to teach them shouldn't be aspirational, schools should approach them with the same rigor they apply to their math and literacy curriculums. Finally, number 3, my favorite, bring kids together and let them really get to know one another. Proximity is only a starting place for changing minds about difference. The work that's required to forge real bonds and deconstruct prejudice is far more complex. A great place to start is curriculum like ours that brings students together to solve a problem, tell a story, or make an impact. We cannot continue to abide systems that keep students with disabilities physically or culturally segregated from their non-disabled peers and expect for them to feel like or become a part of us. We have to transform those old spaces and practices into new ones where students are expected to collaborate, to include, and to believe and behave like everyone belongs. At the NORA project, we call the values embedded within this system of activities, we call this the Ability Inclusive Mindset, AIM for short. And we strive through our programming to help teachers and ultimately their students think differently about disability, to consider the disabled perspective by talking to the folks in their communities who live it firsthand, and to adopt accessible and inclusive practices, to aim higher. We're only a few years in, but the data suggests we're onto something. In NORA Project Schools, community culture shifts and students see themselves as teammates, responsible for one another's success. This makes classroom management easier because students co-regulate, meaning they help each other, which requires less adult intervention in the classroom. And teachers report a marked reduction in bullying and antisocial behaviors. And minds are changing about disability too. At the end of the 2018-2019 school year, 3 times as many students without disabilities believed they had things in common with their peers with disabilities by the end of the school year. And best of all, 97% of students who identify as disabled reported that the NORA project made them feel proud of who they are. Let me tell you what I've learned from NORA and the NORA project and becoming a student of disability. Smart disabled people like my college classmate are not an anomaly. I'm mortified that I even thought that. At this point, I'm so deep into aspiring allyship, I cannot for the life of me understand how the non-disabled majority isn't listening on a large scale to what the disability community has been telling us for decades. I'm going to summarize it here, but I encourage you to listen to the leaders of the movement and hear what they have to say themselves. Many of them have TED Talks of their own that have supported me in my work. But right now, when I'm listening to the community, this is what I hear them saying. We are people, full, complex people. We have rights, legal rights, and innate human rights. Stop treating our access like an afterthought. Our dignity is an object of your benevolence, your kindness toward us as charity. Listen to us, learn about us, include us. Allow us to live the lives we want and are entitled to live. Can't we do that? I'm not trying to say this is easy. Clearly, there's a whole lot of reimagining to do. But we are primed for reimagining right now. The pandemic has changed the way we work, the way we connect with those we love. It's laid bare massive systemic oppression and has kindled within us a desire to build more just, more equitable systems. It's made clear that our decisions impact others, that our personal well-being is tied to the well-being of all of our neighbors in all of their diversity. And as part of this awakening, it's time to unlearn the oppressive cultural narratives we learned by inference. And to do that, we have to center the voices that for too long have been on the margins. Just imagine if disability studies, empathy education, and real, equitable inclusion were ubiquitous in American education. I think the paradigm could shift. The time has come for Nora and everyone else. Thank you.
Most kids spend the majority of their day in school. But what goes on in that school, as well as what they learn at home, can greatly impact how they learn. Our final speaker is going to reveal some truths that impact how children of color learn. Bryant Moore is an educator, published author, and community activist who has worked in marginalized communities, mentoring, teaching, and advocating for the underrepresented. In this talk, he will demonstrate how a more inclusive education and positive racial socializations can greatly improve the classroom experience for students of color. We now welcome to the stage Bryant.
And the teacher said, we found America, we fought the war, we gained independence from the wicked King George, and we discovered the West, we learned it the best, and we made great cities from a little or less than we built the train, which really gave us our name, pushing us into a time called the Industrial Age, and oh, you should be proud, oh, look at us now, because we, wow. Meanwhile, the students thought, why can't we find we in the lesson that he taught? When he says we, something in the lesson feels off. Teacher, I have a question. When you say we, are we included in that expression? Not we as in we, but we as in me. And not me as in me, but me as in we's that look like me. And I know that you already talked about slavery. But that isn't enough to satisfy the craving in my soul, to be proud of the position that I hold inside of the whole. When you say we, who is me in the context of we? What happens when children of color can't see the me in we? For the past 10 years of my career in education, I've spent countless hours sitting through professional developments, talking to fellow teachers, and reading the latest best practice research on how to engage children of color. You see, it's the elephant in the room in most schools. We talk about raising the expectations for all children. We talk about restorative practices for all children. But we know that these issues of disengagement and low achievement disproportionately affects children of color. Almost 80% of Black and brown children can't read at grade level. Children of color are 5 times more likely to be suspended or expelled from school, more likely to be labeled as special needs or special education, more likely to drop out. And I haven't even talked about the school to prison pipeline yet. Almost 50,000 children in the United States, 50,000 children are in juvenile detention centers, and 64% of that is Black or brown. You see, what we want to know is how do we engage those children? You see, we often blame external factors, poverty, lack of 2 parents in the home, inequity or inequality of resources, negative peer pressure. But what's interesting and frustrating at times is that even when you remove those external factors, many of these issues still persist. Take poverty, for example. Even in scenarios where poverty is not a barrier and children of color come from affluent 2-parent households, they're still outperformed by their white counterparts. In fact, white children that are labeled low socioeconomic status often perform equally or better than children of color not labeled the same. And since Brown versus Board of Education, even despite all of our education initiatives, the achievement gap has narrowed in some years, but invariably stayed consistent. You see, we fail so often because we are misunderstanding this issue. We have to stop focusing on isolated external factors and take a closer look at internal factors. In my second year of teaching, I was mentoring a group of African American boys on my lunch break. In the midst of the conversation, one of the boys shouted out, "Mr. Moore, why are we black?" I said, "Well, we're black because of something called melanin. I mean, everybody has melanin. We just have a little more, which makes us a little darker." Then I said, "But melanin has a lot of great benefits. One of the best benefits of melanin is protection from the sun." He looked. He said, "Oh." The next morning, he came running down the hallway. He said, Mr. Moore, I told my mom what you said about the reason why we were black because of something called melanin." I don't think I've ever heard that much pride in his voice. This was a profound moment for me because out of all the things that I had taught him, what resonated the most was the reason why he was black, and what's more, that being black had some benefit. Let me ask you a question. When was the first time that you recognized what your race was? You see, studies show that children of color recognize their race as early as 3 years old. I remember when my baby girl first started school. She was only one of 3 children of color in her classroom. And about 3 months into kindergarten, she came home one day and said, "Daddy, why are we brown people?" You see, how do children of color discover race? And more importantly, when they discover it, how do they make meaning of it? You see, all things considered equal, children of color, academically and developmentally, progress equally to their white counterparts, all the way up until about the 4th grade. Something happens in the 4th grade. Theorists like Dr. Jawan Kunjufu call it the 4th grade phenomenon. In 4th grade, children of color become disinterested in school. This disengagement has a direct correlation with identity development, and more importantly for children of color, racial identity. Dr. William Cross, one of the first theorists to situate racial identity development into a framework, found that we develop our racial identity in stages. And what takes us from the first stage of incognizance, where race within itself is not an important factor for identity development, and moves us into the second stage of awareness, where race becomes a dominant factor for identity development, or what he calls encounters. Encounters are shocking, personal, or social events that temporarily dislodges us from our present understanding of our identity and moves us into a new interpretation of who we are and our place in society. In more layman's terms, encounters are temporary identity crises. You see, these encounters can positively inform our identity or negatively inform it. You see, the most important existential question is, who am I? And from birth, we begin to answer that question. Every time we have an encounter and our identity is temporarily dislodged, we are answering the question, who am I? And simultaneously, we're being told who we can be. You see, that day that my daughter came home and asked, "Daddy, why are we brown people?" I knew that she had had an encounter. An encounter like, why is my skin darker than theirs? An encounter like, why do I say my words differently from they do? An encounter like, why is my hair kinky curly? And although these encounters may be innocent, they bring awareness to difference. But it's okay to be different. And it's okay to feel different as long as your difference doesn't make you feel less valuable than anyone else. You see, what's important isn't necessarily the encounter. The encounter is a natural part of identity exploration. What's important is the interpretation of that encounter. You see, without positive racial socialization, children of color often grow to believe that to be non-white also means to be inferior. You see, the boy in my class that day, he wasn't asking why was he black from a scientific standpoint. He was asking, why do I have to be black from an identity standpoint? When you come to the realization that race is fixed, and you believe that your race is inferior, children of color often grow to believe that inferiority is an inescapable reality. Prolonged feelings of inferiority creates psychopathologies, and these psychopathologies are often classified in school as disengagement, low achievement, learning disabilities, oppositional defiance, or just flat out misbehavior. You see, if I'm destined to be inferior, then why try? Prolonged feelings of inferiority create hopelessness. It creates the fourth grade phenomenon. Positive racial socialization is an idea that has been alluded to by many theorists. Theorists like Dr. Alfred Boykins, Dr. Robert Sellers, or Dr. Joy DeGruy. Positive racial socialization is the intentional communication of positive messages, not just for one race, ethnicity, or culture, but for all races, ethnicities, and cultures. To be clear, it's the intentional communication of positive messages about people of color. You see, it's inevitable that we will have racial socialization of some sort. It's inevitable that we will have a racial encounter. What's not guaranteed, however, is that that socialization, that encounter will be positive. In fact, it's more probable that the encounter and the socialization will be negative, particularly negative about those races that are non-white. You see, our society is filled, is saturated with negative socializations for people of color. From the movies and television shows that we watch, where the criminals and the villains and the antagonists are often brown-skinned people or darker complexioned characters, to the language that we speak. Two small words, black and white. These two words carry a lot of meaning in American society. The term black is often seen as negative and bad, whereas the term white is often seen as positive and good. Like, no one ever wants to be blackballed to become the black sheep of the family. And good witches, well, they use white magic. Bad witches, they use black magic. And it's okay to tell a little white lie, but never try to blackmail somebody. And I haven't even told you about angel food cake and devil food cake yet. The interpretation of words and images are powerful, and they can direct the thinking of societies. Here's a simple test. I want you to close your eyes for a second. Now tell me what image comes to mind when I say the word hero, patriot, humanitarian, genius. Was it a white person that you thought of? Just keep your eyes closed for just a second. Now, I want you to keep your eyes closed, and this time, tell me what comes to mind when you think of criminal, terrorist, delinquent. Was it a person of color? You see, this simple social experiment is the base foundation of Harvard's implicit bias test. The reality that negative attributes are often associated with people of color, or positive attributes are often associated with people of non-color. Whites perceive negatively, and people of color internalize negatively. What has your socialization taught you? And what is it teaching our children? You see, when children have a positive framework to encounter race, they show resilience in the face of negative encounters and resistance to implicit bias. Well, how do we instill that positive framework? Well, it starts at home. You see, we've been talking about teachers and schools, but in the lives of children, parents are the first teachers, and home is their first school. So parents of color have to painstakingly help their children develop positive racial identities and provide them with a positive framework to interpret from. You see, studies show that when children of color have positive racial identities, they are less affected by negative encounters and they reject stereotypes. For white parents, it's the opposite. See, the value of whiteness has already been embedded in our society, in our culture. So you have to work to provide your children with a positive framework to encounter children that may not look like them. You see, if my black child was to come into your home, would she feel as valued as your children? Do the movies you watch have black and brown princesses and heroes? Do the bedtime stories you tell stories about little brown children on a journey? Are the action figures and dolls they play with brown with kinky hair? Are you intentionally exposing your children to a culture outside of their own? Because studies show that when people, not just children, but when people have positive experiences with other races, ethnicities, and cultures, they're more resilient and resistant to implicit bias. You see, I know that most of us are raising our children in homogeneous family structures, but we have to prepare them for the heterogeneous global society that we're raising them in. And many times, it's children providing these negative encounters to each other. In a study I recently did called Learning While Black, an exploration of microaggressions in school context, I found that 90% of children of color said their most impactful negative encounter was with a white classmate. And oftentimes a classmate that they considered to be a friend. And according to another study done by the Southern Poverty Law Center, they found that since 2017, white nationalist hate groups have grown by 55%. And their growth and their recruitment was heavily dependent on white adolescent males. You see, a positive framework to encounter race could prevent both of these. And teachers, when those students leave home and they come into our classroom, we have to move away from the Eurocentric hegemonic education and move closer to a humanitarian-centered education. In other words, we have to stop teaching the history of the world through the lens of European exploration and conquest. You see, in the lives of children, school is the most common location for racial encounters and identity crises, not just with classmates and teachers, but also what's being implicitly taught. You see, it's an encounter to read about princesses and princes that may not look like you. And it's an encounter to learn about great thinkers and explorers, scientists and mathematicians that aren't from your ancestors. It's an encounter to read about oppression, and your people are the ones being oppressed. You see, the conquest of Julius Caesar and the greatness of the Roman Empire has to be coupled with the conquest of Mansa Musa and the greatness of the Ghanaian Empire. When we praise the astrological discoveries of Galileo, we have to acknowledge that his discoveries stood on the backs of the many constellation maps that were created by the ancient Africans, the ancient Chinese and ancient Native American civilizations that came before him, and advanced by people like Neil deGrasse Tyson after him. Native American legends, Asian myths, and African folklore can replace nursery rhymes like Mary Had a Little Lamb and Jack and Jill Went Up the Hill. Middle school classes and high school classes have to be filled with the work of Lorraine Hansberry, James Baldwin, Paulo Freire, and Juan Rulfo. You see, children have to be able to see excellence in all cultures, in all races, in all nationalities, outside of the context of white dominant culture, outside of the context of European exploration, and outside of the context of inferiority. You see, 155 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, and 66 years after Brown versus Board of Education, and 12 years after the election of America's first black president, Barack Obama, it's hard not to ask, isn't anything better? Of course it is. But children of color still disproportionately represent low achievement scores, special education classes, suspension and expulsion rates, juvenile detention centers, crime rates, and dropout rates. You see, the unfortunate events of 2020 have allowed us the ability to take a step back. It's allowed us as educators to take a step back. It's allowed us as parents to take a step back and reevaluate our effectiveness in really creating truly equitable communities, truly equitable schools, and raising children with truly equitable ideas. You see, for far too long, excellence, beauty, and intelligence has been defined by whiteness in our society. But whiteness is not something that children of color can ever attain. And so if we truly want all children to thrive, we have to provide them with a framework that they can see themselves in. By providing our children with a positive framework to encounter race, we not only teach them to love the skin that they're in, but we teach them to appreciate others that may not look like them. We teach them that unity is not uniformity. And we teach them that there's beauty in difference. So teacher, I have a question. When you say we, are we included in that expression? Not we as in we, but we as in me. And not me as in me, but me as in we's that look like me. And I know that you already talked about slavery. But that isn't enough to satisfy the craving in my soul, to be proud of the position that I hold inside of the whole when you say we. So please explain to me your current position as it relates to your disposition in creating a classroom, a school, a community, and a society that will make me feel proud when you say we. Children of color just want to be able to see the me in we. Thank you.
So our theme today was Create Your New World. All three of our speakers have taken a challenge head on and found success by thinking outside the box and reinvigorating their perspectives on how to solve a problem. But before we wrap up, let's stop and recognize the people and organizations that helped make today's event possible. Thank you to Express Video Productions for filming and editing our talks and for streaming this live event today. Thank you to our generous sponsor, the Friends of the Northbrook Library, for sponsoring our entire event. Thank you to the Northbrook Public Library marketing team who created all of the promotion for this event. And thanks to all of our speakers who spent countless hours creating and practicing their talks and for sharing their ideas worth spreading with you today. Thank you to the additional staff members who helped review the many TEDx applications that came in. They include Brian Bruger, Jill Franklin, Bridget Golombeski, and Rachel Kaplan. Also, thank you to our TEDx Northbrook Library Committee. They spent 9 months crafting this event, reviewing speaker applications and editing the talks. They include Tracy Gossage, Caitlin Hannon, Sue Schmidt, Ariel Valine. And finally, thank you to you. Without an audience and without someone to hear these amazing ideas worth spreading, well, we wouldn't be here today. So we have one final favor to ask of you. If you signed up by email, you will receive a 1-question survey from the TED organization. That's the only thing that you will receive from them, but it's critical to fill it out so that we can continue with our license and keep bringing you these wonderful events. Thank you so much for joining us today. Have a great weekend.